the most successful ideology. The most successful political ideology of modern times is arguably nationalism. It's so successful that it has been, at times, adopted by and combined with every other major political ideology, including liberalism, conservatism, communism, socialism, and fascism, with perhaps anarchism being the only exception, by its very nature. Nationalism is highly diverse and differs from nation to nation in key aspects. Historically speaking, nationalism has been utilized in vastly divergent ways, both to conquer and to liberate, both to build democracy and to establish autocracy, and by leftist movements as well as by rightist ones. Nationalism is sometimes not even seen as an ideology, but something that is just inherent in every nation. In colloquial usage, the terms nation and state are often used as synonyms, but they refer to two different political concepts. A state, most famously a sovereign state, is a type of political entity, while a nation is a social group consisting of individuals who identify themselves as connected with one another. To use the famous phrase coined by Irish political scientist Benedict Anderson, a nation is an imagined community. When these two concepts of nation and state come together, and when a state, usually a sovereign state, is created to serve the interests of a specific nation, this is called a nation-state. Finally, nationalism is the belief that the nation should form the basis of the political order. This is not to be confused with patriotism, which is a sentiment of psychological attachment to a particular national group or entity. As a result, essentially every nationalist is a patriot, but not every patriot is a nationalist. The term nationalism was first used in 1789 in the context of the French Revolution. Nationalism was initially a counter-movement against the old absolutist monarchies of Europe. It offered a new philosophy of government. Previously, individuals, whether subjects of kings or other monarchs in this social order, were seen as given by God. Nationalism instead offered a vision of individuals not as subjects but as citizens, owing allegiance not to a king but to a nation. As a result, nationalism created an avenue towards more secular and less authoritarian modes of government. The nation is essentially the source of all sovereignty, nor can any individual or any body of men be entitled to any authority which is not expressly derived from it. Nationalism had its first great historical phase during the Napoleonic Wars, when it was first adopted by the revolutionary French to advance military mobilization and to establish a renewed legislative and cultural system. However, it then became a guiding light to the enemies of the French who were trying to liberate themselves from Napoleon's troops. Ironically, French nationalism inspired Germans to see themselves as German, paving the way for German unification by differentiating themselves from the French. After France was defeated in 1815, nationalism was, for a while, contained by the reactionary elites of Europe who were trying to establish something akin to the old system. But nationalism kept festering and rapidly re-emerged as a powerful force among Germans, Italians, Poles, and other nations that aspired to create nation-states for their respective fatherlands. After the nationalist uprisings of 1848 were defeated, nationalism began to increasingly attract conservative forces with its promise of stability, social cohesion, and internal order. The nationalist-minded middle classes looked on favorably as the conservative establishments of the powerful states of Prussia and Piedmont advanced the causes of German and Italian national unification, bringing about the creations of two new major nation-states. The great questions of the day will not be settled by speeches and majority decisions. That was the great mistake of 1848–49, but by blood and iron, said by Otto von Bismarck. Nationalism turned into a true mass movement by the end of the 19th century, when general education, mass literacy, the idea of the nation-state, and the increasing availability of print media allowed individuals across all social classes to observe and discuss national political processes. In the 1880s, popular nationalism helped drive the European powers into the peak of imperialism and growing colonial and military competition against each other. Nationalism became an excuse for imperial powers to subjugate and conquer other peoples. It became the justification for civilizing others, and it culminated in the outbreak of the First World War, 1914 to 1918. The end of that war allowed a whole range of nations to gain their own nation-states, but the unsatisfactory peace settlement led to renewed growth of vitriolic and revanchist schools of nationalism. Nationalism became a central building block of the various movements that make up fascism, which is very likely the most violent and belligerent of the great historical political ideologies, and the establishment of various fascist governments, ultimately leading to yet another world war. While attacked, the Russians, communist in the Soviet Union, used nationalism as a rallying cry against the Germans. After World War II, nationalism had also become a guiding light for anti-colonial liberation movements in Africa and Asia, and many new sovereign states joined the map during the decolonization period. The last great wave of new nation-states finally came about in the 1990s with the collapse of various multi-ethnic socialist federations, most famously, of course, the Soviet Union. In the 21st century, after the Cold War and globalization, nationalism has increasingly taken on a role of anti-globalization and skepticism towards supranational organizations such as the United Nations and the European Union. As mentioned, different nationalists have had different ideas on how to become part of the nation. Nationalism can be divided between inclusive nationalism and exclusive nationalism. The primary example of inclusive nationalism would be civic nationalism, where nationhood is mainly determined by mindset and allegiance. As long as an individual feels loyalty towards the nation and acts upon that loyalty, they belong to the nation, and nationhood is thus voluntary. More exclusive forms of nationalism pay less attention to mindset and more attention to human differences. The most exclusive form of nationalism is ethnic nationalism. A middle ground between inclusive and exclusive nationalism can be found in cultural nationalism, which appeals to some degree to a cultural mindset, but also places higher value on tradition, background, homeland, and especially language than civic nationalism does. As a result, it is not impossible to become a member of the nation, but it requires a lot of work. Cultural nationalism is thus neither entirely hereditary nor entirely voluntary. Beyond the categories of inclusive and exclusive, we can further identify several types of nationalism, including liberal, conservative, expansionist, and anti-colonial. The oldest form of nationalism is liberal nationalism, which emerged during the French Revolution. Liberal nationalists pursued popular self-government and liberal principles. As history progressed, many liberal movements have begun to avoid nationalism, even though movements such as constitutional patriotism, which is the idea of attaching patriotic sentiment to the democratic and pluralistic institutions of society, can be counted as part of the legacy of liberal nationalism. Many early non-Western nationalists, such as Sun Yat-sen in China, were also inspired by liberal nationalism. But as nationalism became more attractive to conservative forces, the emergence of conservative nationalism was only a matter of time, and this movement became dominant by 1880. Conservatives, such as Benjamin Disraeli, Otto von Bismarck, or Tsar Alexander III, began to embrace nationhood and nationalism as tools of political power. Conservative nationalism is focused on preserving social cohesion and public order, promising firm government and strong leadership. Recent examples of conservative nationalism can be found in Charles de Gaulle in France and Margaret Thatcher in the United Kingdom. Conservative nationalists are especially concerned with the defense and preservation of sovereignty and national culture, and are very skeptical of international organizations infringing on the privileges of national governments. Perhaps the most infamous subtype of nationalism is expansionist nationalism, which has captured the public imagination to the point that more moderate nationalist movements have tended to avoid public association with nationalism altogether. Expansionist nationalism is defined by its tendency towards diplomatic aggression and militarism, and has historically served as a driving force behind colonial imperialism, the global arms race, and eventually the rise of fascism. An inherent part of expansionist nationalism is chauvinism, which prescribes an inequality of the value of nations and the right of the strong to rule over the weak. While nationalism is also used by anti-colonial movements that arose in the colonies against the colonizers, as more revolutionary elements joined the anti-colonial movement. The legacy of anti-colonial nationalism in the countries it produced is a decisively anti-Western cultural bend after independence. Liberals were the first ideological group to adopt nationalism for themselves in the early to mid-19th century, and they tried to utilize and form nation-states to advance personal and collective liberties. Liberals view the nation in a civic sense, putting great emphasis on voluntary political allegiance. Liberal nationalists generally believe that nations have the right to self-determination, and thus advocate an international system of co-equal nation-states that cooperate in mutual interest. The second major ideology after liberals to adopt nationalism were conservatives, resulting in the aforementioned conservative nationalism that grew in the late 19th century. Conservative nationalists view the nation as organic, binding individuals together by their identity and heritage, most usually shared history, and sometimes ethnicity. Conservatives value nation-states as good, reliable sources of social cohesion and stability, and usually apply some religious elements to their nationalism as well. The growing movement of socialists emerged at a similar time as nationalism, who tend to be critical of nations which they view as artificial divisions of humanity, propping up the established order of classes in each nation-state. Socialists, as a result, have a long tradition of forming international rather than national organizations. However, more recently, beginning in the 20th century, some socialist movements have begun to utilize types of socialist nationalism, like in the Soviet Union, which devised its people as different from the German. But perhaps most critical of nationalism, even more so than socialists, are anarchists, who view the principle of statehood very critically and thus have to reject the nation-state. Further, they share socialist criticisms of nationhood as arbitrary and divisive. Conceit, arrogance, and egotism are the essentials of patriotism. Patriotism assumes that our globe is divided into little spots, each one surrounded by an iron gate. Unique among the major ideologies in their relationship to nationalism are fascists, as their ideology was from its very inception designed in the context of nationalism and completely embraced it. Fascism was perhaps the most extreme interpretation of the concept of a nation-state, and proposed a state to completely engulf a nation and to exclude and eliminate all of its enemies, both real and imagined, both domestic and foreign. Fascists view nations as organic and natural, and reject civic forms of nationalism in favor of more exclusive terms of nationhood, often biological. Fascists also apply a principle of social Darwinism to nationhood, and have the idea that nations are designed and destined to compete against each other, and that only the strongest are worthy of survival. Nationalism was the driving ideology of both colonization and decolonization. It inspired leftists and rightists, spurred conquest and liberation, was used by capitalists and by socialists, and by those contesting authority as well as by those seeking to expand it. But perhaps most remarkable thing about nationalism is that it has continued to adapt to ever-changing global conditions.